In between reporting on the big tournaments, I like to go back and look at some classic games, and that's what I'm doing today. I'm looking at Game 1 of the Kasparov-Karpov match from 1985. Now, you might recall that their first match was played at the end of 1984 and the first couple of months of 1985, and that was abandoned after 4.5 months under controversial circumstances. I won't go into that now, but basically the players agreed to have another match starting in September 1985 over 24 games. So the players had 6 months to prepare, and Kasparov relates that straight away he set about preparing himself for this second match, and he developed a strategy, and he would prepare himself in openings. He wanted to replenish his stock of opening ideas. He wanted to prepare himself physically. He wanted to work on his physical stamina. And also he wanted to look at his positional chess, because in that first match he admitted that basically he'd been outplayed strategically by Karpov. And I think this first game of their 1985 match shows, I think, very well how Kasparov had improved his positional play and his positional understanding. Let's take a look. D4 from Kasparov, no big surprise, and the opening is a Nimzo-Indian defence. So black, by pinning here, prevents white claiming any more of the centre with E4. Now, previously Kasparov had played in very classical fashion this mainline Rubinstein variation with E3. But in this match he played knight f3, and after c5 he played this fianchetto variation. Now, this is strategically very complex because white accepts that his queenside pawn structure is going to be compromised, but he gets great play with his pieces. In particular, this bishop exerts great pressure down the long diagonal, and we see this in many queen's pawn openings, for example the Catalan, where this bishop, this fianchettoed bishop, is often much stronger than the bishop on c8. Now, there are many ways to play this position. You might recall that in the Kramnik-Anand World Championship match in 2008, Anand played like this. And this nowadays is one of the main lines, very theoretical. And in fact, Kramnik beat Anand in that game with white. Although Kramnik lost the match. But I think that just shows, that's 2008. This opening is still very current and still played a lot. Okay, going back to this position, Karpov played knight e4. Now this is obviously a critical move because black is attacking the knight on c3 straight away. And the queen comes up to defend, and now another sharp move from Karpov, queen a5, placing more pressure on the knight. Kasparov took on e4, and bishop takes c3. Now obviously this can't be captured because then the queen will come down, and after the check will take the rook on a1. So going back to this position, Kasparov instead blocks with the bishop. Now this had all been played before. It's actually a quite well-known line. This is now more or less forced. And okay, there are several moves here. You can take on d4. You can play knight c6. But here Karpov played queen b6, which is quite a daring move, actually, continuing this. This adventurous raid with the queen. So basically there are two pawns threatened. And Kasparov took on c5 and Karpov took on b2. So you can see now white's pawns have been shattered, But as we'll see, this advanced c-pawn here actually plays quite an important role because it cramps black. It discourages black from breaking out with b or d pawn, and that means it's going to be difficult for black to develop that bishop on c8. In the meantime, there's this queen to look out for here, so Kasparov has to deal with that. Now, you have to take great care here if you're going on an adventure with your queen. You know, I think it would be inadvisable, for example, to grab another pawn. Let me just show you the kind of play that white can get in this kind of situation. So, first of all, well, this is tricky. He's now threatening to win the queen, so the queen goes back. The queen is losing time, and you can see white's pieces are very active, and suddenly this knight is coming in here. The queen is still rather offside. I mean, this is tremendous compensation for a pawn. Okay, so instead of this, Karpov played queen c3, and that's a better move because white is going to have to deal with this pin. It won't be possible just to get castled while the knight is pinned, so Kasparov has to just step back and offer a trade of queens. Well, this was clearly what Karpov was angling for when he played this whole variation with queen b6. He wanted the security of an endgame. And he now played knight a6, and that threatens the pawn here, and the pawn came up. Now, as I said, black needs to try to break out with one of these moves, so Karpov tries to do that. Bishop here. Now, one of the reasons I think that Karpov must have felt that he was okay in this position is that the king sits very well in the centre of the board. But let's see how things developed. Now the rook came across, so Karpov is preparing one of these moves. But suddenly knight e4 just clamps the d6 square. Now, I think we come to a very interesting position because this is already a critical moment in the game. Kasparov said, "This is precisely the kind of situation which demands a combination of general strategy and concrete dynamic play." Now, in this position, Karpov chose to bring the knight back here and then to try to exchange off this knight on d6. Well, this is kind of typical Karpov, you could say, that he's relying on just sort of, well, fairly natural moves, trading off strong piece. But when Kasparov talks about dynamic play, he's talking about moves that go against the grain, that require concrete calculation. And here there was a chance for Karpov to try to equalise the game with a dynamic move that requires in great calculation. This kind of thing is typical Kasparov. So what happens if black takes here? Well, this is quite a forcing continuation. I just want to look at this in some detail. So white still has a grip on the position with this knight. Now there's only one way that black can deal with that, and that's to attack this pawn. So if black can take this or force the retreat, well, then there's f5, and this will be fine. But now white actually wins a piece. Now it's quite possible that Karpov got this far and just thought, I'm not touching this. But Kasparov goes on with his analysis here. By the way, I'm using as my basis for these notes Kasparov's book. Perhaps you can see that. Kasparov versus Karpov, Garry Kasparov on Modern Chess, published by Everyman Chess. It's quite a weighty tome, you can see. It's quite a fat book, lots of heavy analysis, but Kasparov does a brilliant job of explaining the psychological nuances of the battle. But let's just go on with this variation. I'm sure that Karpov would have just stopped around about here. But Kasparov continues, and, well, I haven't got time to go into the whys and wherefores of this long variation, but this variation is sort of more or less forced and forcing. This is best play for both sides. And they would end up in this situation where white is a piece up, but black has 2 pawns for the piece. And Kasparov thinks this would be very difficult for white to win, and this was maybe Karpov's, a decent chance for Karpov to get a draw. He's obviously worse, but tenable. Instead, Karpov continues in quite a routine way, just exchanging off that knight on d6. And now here, I think, is a good moment where we see Kasparov's excellent positional judgment, or improved positional judgment. Here he has a choice. Which one does he exchange off? At first glance, it looks as though this should be a good way for white to play, but in fact, with some precise steps, actually black should be able to equalise this position. And here you can see, although white can take here, black would be able to take here, and black should be alright in this position. Instead, Kasparov exchanged off the knight and then brought the rook over, so you can see there's great pressure on this pawn, but Karpov fights back by pressurising the c4 pawn. Kasparov steps out of the line of the bishop, and now here another moment where Kasparov uses his judgment very well. At first glance, it looks tempting simply to take this pawn on b6, but Kasparov went further with his analysis. How many of us would just grab this pawn? But watch what happens. Magically, this bishop has come to an excellent square. It was a rotten piece on c8, but suddenly it's transformed into a really powerful piece supported by the pawn. And although white is a pawn up, as Kasparov says, this is actually very hard work for white. It's a clear extra pawn, but how do you advance this one? And this rook is tied to the defence of the pawn. In the meantime, this rook can come over to hassle the king and hassle the king side. Not easy to win at all. Instead, Kasparov captured en passant. Now, if rook takes, then c5, you can see this pin is very annoying. The rook has to go back, and the pawn advances. And actually, the big problem is that this bishop is in a terrible situation. Black has to defend against the pawn advance, and then this actually traps the bishop, and this is a theme all the way through. So this move was played by Karpov, so he stepped out of the pin and still hoping to recover the pawn. Now rook a4, it seems that this is actually winning straight away, because if bishop takes pawn, then bishop b7 overloads this rook. You see it can't maintain the defence of the bishop. But Kasparov admitted that he was kind of so excited about being on top in this first game and realised how he had a winning position, and he couldn't stop himself moving very quickly, and he wasn't, well, he saw a reasonable way to play, but yeah, he missed something even quicker. This is what he'd seen. He saw that the bishop was trapped anyway. Now, black can actually save the piece in this slightly convoluted way. You can see this can't be taken because of the pin. But Kasparov had seen that he just reaches an endgame where he's a clear pawn up. And it's, you know, some rook and pawn endgames, a pawn up can still be drawn, but this is absolutely clear that white is winning because he has such control over the position, and this queenside pawn majority is so well advanced. And black simply has no counterplay here. Black always has to keep an eye on the passed pawn on the queen side. Karpov is exchanging pawns here on the king side, but actually it has no real effect, and Kasparov wrapped this game up very, very easy. Let's just go through the final few moves. This is an excellent move. Of course, if this is exchanged, then the connected pass pawns go through. So Karpov is forced to play here, but that blocks out Black's rook. And now it's time for the king to enter to try and drive away the rook. And here the game was actually adjourned, but Karpov resigned the game without resuming. I mean, this is terribly easy. For example, we could just come in and exchange off, and well, here the king comes in, and you can see the king can't come across to support the rook. I think this really shows that Kasparov had rounded his game in the intervening period, and he was able to match Karpov in his positional play. Thanks very much for watching. Look out for my reports on the Candidates tournament that starts next Thursday in Khanty-Mansiysk in Russia. And well, it's going to be a great tournament. Thank you.